Welcome back to the channel. It's your host, Wes, and it's time to take a critical look at Amazing Spider-Man number 6, also known as Amazing Spider-Man number 900. My goodness, that's a lot of comic books. We are in the 60th anniversary year of the first appearance of Peter Parker Spider-Man, and there's certainly going to be a lot of celebrations. This is meant to be a milestone comic, and I think that's probably one of the big lows of this comic book. Traditionally, Spider-Man kind of has a formula when it comes to milestone comics. When you get to one of the big ones, like a 500, 600, 700, traditionally you're going to get a huge reveal, like a big game changer as far as the conclusion of a storyline, or perhaps less often, like the big introduction of something brand new. And we don't really get that one here. And I think that kind of is a letdown. I know that's the way I kind of took it. And what I thought was interesting, they obviously started this new Amazing Spider-Man run with Zeb Wells and John Romita Jr., who's not on art in this one. It's actually Ed McGuinness. But they started with this big mystery of something that happened 6 months ago. There's an enormous crater. Everyone hates Peter Parker, including his aunt. MJ apparently has a full-grown family now. And I assume that they set it up there to pay it off here, to give you something to pay off big time in ASM 900. That is not the case. I don't know why they're calling this Amazing Spider-Man 6 and 900. They probably should have just called it ASM 900 and then had ASM number 6 come out in a couple of weeks and continue the story that Zeb Wells is doing there, because this is essentially just a one-shot story. It's kind of meant to be a celebration, I guess, of Spider-Man, but there's too many zany jokes in this comic book. One of the strengths of Zeb Wells' run on Hellions was that he did have a lot of jokes. But when it was time to be serious, he was able to hit really good character moments that really paid off within the story and made you love the team and the characters even more. Unfortunately, he never kind of pulls his foot off the gas here in this one as far as the jokes, and you never really have time to have a meaningful experience with the characters or maybe some type of insight into Spider-Man. I think that kind of fails on that level, but it certainly wins out on a lot of other levels. There are a lot of highs here. The art by Ed McGuinness is absolutely fabulous. There's this one action scene at the beginning with J. Jonah Jameson and Doc Ock's, well, it's not Doc Ock, I guess it's his arms, and it's just really well done. The facial characteristics were really on point. It was really funny, it was really fun, and it felt like something befitting a Spider-Man comic, and I was really blown away by it. So the art here is good, although it's a little bit inconsistent because there's too many inkers. It's very well paced. For a 92-page comic book, it really flies by. Of course, it is $10, and therein kind of lies another problem. It is a $10 comic book, but it doesn't say much, and I don't know that you can really consider it a celebration of Spider-Man. So let's get into the details. I've talked about what worked, what hasn't worked, but let me explain why that is. We open up the story, there's a big surprise birthday party, and everyone's waiting to surprise Peter, but he's early, because he's on time, because Peter's always late. He kind of ruins the surprise. J. Jonah Jameson is nowhere to be found, and we get a lot of cameos in this comic book, and here specifically, we get a cameo from Flash Thompson, who Peter Parker believes is dead, and these two characters have a long history together. During the early days of Spider-Man, it was pretty much Archie with superheroes. Flash Thompson was certainly a big part of that. He was kind of a bully. He had a very redemptive story arc, going to Vietnam, becoming handicapped through a war wound, becoming the Venom symbiote. So there is a lot of history between the two characters, and he finally sees him alive, and he's just like, oh, it's nice to see you. I'm glad you could show up in the comic book, which felt really out of place, especially for a celebration of Amazing Spider-Man. You throw this big reveal into Peter Parker, you expect some type of emotional reaction to it, but that is not the case because the story needs to move on. We do finally get to see J. Jonah Jameson show up, and there's a reason he's not around. He's been abducted by the Doc Ock arms. This is a wonderful action sequence that occurs very early on, but during this, we do get this kind of strange, I don't know, is it a love triangle? It feels like Mockingbird and Black Cat are squabbling over Peter Parker's affections, which I guess would have made sense at a certain time, but not really now, especially with what Nick Spencer did with his Amazing Spider-Man run that was very well received and really built up the relationship, or built it back up at least, between Peter Parker and Mary Jane, which obviously is absent now. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I thought that was a weird sequence in the story, although it does look very good and it is very fun. Peter Parker Spider-Man does eventually save J. Jonah Jameson from the Doc Ock tentacles, and he gets trapped himself, and the robotic arms end up spelling help on the wall because something is amiss. Not only was J. Jonah Jameson lost, Doc Ock is lost, and Spider-Man needs to get to the bottom of this. And we have been introduced at this point to the big villain in this story, the Living Brain. We have not seen this character, to my knowledge, in quite some time. I kind of dig them bringing a character like this back, and he's got this weird avatar that he's made, and he is trying to get down to the focal question. The one question his maker always asked, but was never, ever able to answer. Who is Spider-Man? He wants to know the identity of Spider-Man, so he has abducted, essentially, all of his major villains. He's abducted the Sinister Six, he's captured them, and he's trying to ascertain the identity of Spider-Man. And along the way, he not only abducts the Sinister Six, he actually goes out there and abducts all the people the Living Brain assumes knows the identity of Peter Parker, including Aunt May, Flash Thompson, Anna Marconi, and others, I think including Black Cat. And it turns out he doesn't just want to know the identity of Spider-Man. He wants to know who is Spider-Man deep down in the soul of the character. What makes Spider-Man tick? That's what he really wants to know. So it's a deeper question. And this here has potential to really embody what a milestone issue could be. But as you can see by this page, when that fact comes out, he's so busy laying on the jokes, Zeb Wells, that he can't get out of his own way to tell the meaningful story that is supposed to be enjoyed in this milestone comic. And that is kind of the frustrating thing that I came away with from this, because it ends up feeling like zany filler rather than an exciting 92-page, very high-priced milestone comic celebrating the character or getting us some type of real insight into Spider-Man himself. My assumption when they announced that the Sinister Adaptoid was coming into this, it was going to have the Sinister Six all becoming one character, I assumed that they were just kind of putting those characters together, but it's deeper than that. Well, at least it's different. He's actually imprisoned the Sinister Six. He's sucked out their personalities and their powers, and he's combined them into the Super Adaptoid to create the Sinister Adaptoid. So in his mind, you have the characters that are the Sinister Six kind of arguing with each other within the Sinister Adaptoid. You have Kraven, Vulture, Mysterio, Sandman, Electro, and Doc Ock all arguing over who's going to take him out. And whenever that personality, I guess, is dominant within the Sinister Adaptoid, they use that power and kind of thing. And of course, Spider-Man does run into this character, and not surprisingly, he does succumb to the Sinister Adaptoid. It's just too powerful. The Sinister Adaptoid wins, and he takes him to the Living Brain, where his friends and family are being interrogated, and Spider-Man finally comes to. He fights the Sinister Adaptoid again. He's on the run, and he finally discovers the imprisoned members of the actual Sinister Six, most notably Doc Ock. They have this back and forth. It's actually somewhat interesting. It's almost like Doc Ock appreciates the hero that Spider-Man is, and he lets him know, I am not the only one that is in the clutches of the Living Brain that has been imprisoned as he tries to learn your identity. The other Sinister Six are here as well. And at first, they're actually quite rude to Peter Parker, and there's a lot of snarky comments, and then they realize they need to team up with Spider-Man to fight the Sinister Adaptoid, and they change their tune. So Peter Parker decides to trust them, and he frees all of his greatest enemies that have been in prison so they can help him fight the Sinister Adaptoid. And while Peter Parker Spider-Man is trying to lead the charge as they fight this big, enormous Adaptoid creature, the Sinister Six cannot get on the same page. Every single one of them wants to lead. All of them are just arguing with each other. And as they try to fight this thing, they keep hitting each other with their powers. And they're basically bickering the entire time. While this is visually a very fun sequence, it does bog down a bit with all the bickering. But it turns out this isn't the only Sinister Six that are bickering. The Sinister Six personalities within the Sinister Adaptoid himself are also arguing the entire time. And essentially he ends up destroying himself, because the Sinister Six in real life can't get along, and they certainly can't get along as part of a hive mind within the Sinister Adaptoid, and they decide it's time to destroy the Living Brain. They find the enormous green brain that's hooked up to all the electronics, and Spider-Man says, this thing is living, it's certainly implied in the name, and I can't let you kill it. So, of course, they decide to turn on Spider-Man. Doc Ock leads the charge, and he says it's time to kill him, and they all turn on Spider-Man. Things do not look very good. He's overcome the Sinister Adaptoid, but he's not going to be able to overcome the Sinister Six themselves. And that's when the Living Brain and its avatar come to the forefront, and they realize what Spider-Man really is. Even though he's done all these things, Spider-Man is still a hero. He's still fighting for me so that I can live. He says, I collected Spider-Man's greatest enemies so I could destroy him, abducted those he loved so I could know him, all in the service of the question, who is Spider-Man? And yet he stands here ready to give his life to protect me because I was defenseless. And so my question is answered. This is Spider-Man. And in theory, that is an impactful moment, an impactful statement. Unfortunately, it's jammed inside 90 pages of zany filler nonsense kind of thing. It's a fun story, but it's not nearly as impactful as I imagined Zeb Wells wanted it to be. The living brain comes to his aid. He ends up freeing him. He takes the villains back to where he belongs, and Spider-Man saved the day. And then we get this really strange encounter at the very end. Black Cat finally finds Peter Parker later, and she lets him know you need to call your aunt. She's very worried about you after your party and you left. And J. Jonah Jameson said that you had stomach problems and you were farting a whole lot. And then they decide that they're going to kiss. It's so out of nowhere. It makes no sense within the Marvel Comics universe as we speak. This almost feels like sour grapes about Nick Spencer, because I imagine Amazing Spider-Man 900, when they mapped it out, was probably going to be when Mary Jane and Peter Parker got married again. Everything Nick Spencer was doing within his run was leading to that. Obviously, he got lured away by the Substack money and ended up leaving his Spider-Man run prematurely and never made it to Amazing Spider-Man 900. So this kind of feels to me like an FU to Nick Spencer. Screw you. You wanted to rebuild the Mary Jane Peter Parker relationship again. You left early. We've destroyed it, and now he's kissing another woman type of thing. Obviously, these two have had a relationship in the past, but it certainly didn't feel very organic within the story itself or what's been going on with Spider-Man. So I think it definitely ended on a negative note, at least for me. I really wish, with all the momentum that Nick Spencer's Spider-Man run had and how many people enjoyed it, that they really could have paid off some of the stuff. People want the Mary Jane Peter Parker relationship back. They want it restored. They want them married again. They still have a kid that's out there in limbo and stuff. I wish they could undo this stuff. It definitely felt like that's what Nick Spencer was doing. Is Zeb Wells not allowed to do it, or does he not want to do it? I'm not really sure. This doesn't really flow into anything that we've been reading in Amazing Spider-Man. It's just kind of a weird one-shot story. I don't know that it's a celebration, but there's certainly a lot to like here. The art is phenomenal. It's very fast-paced. There's a ton of action. But is it a milestone issue? Does it deserve the Amazing Spider-Man number 900 moniker? I say it probably doesn't. I'll recommend it if you love Spider-Man. It's probably $10 well spent. It's not a bad story. But as a Spider-Man milestone, I don't think it really hits the mark. What I think Zeb Wells was going for here was done much better by Chip Zdarsky several years ago. Certainly does a much better job of what I think the heart of this comic book story was. And I still think Peter Parker Amazing Spider-Man 310 is probably the best single issue comic book of the last 10 years.